Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Dr. G.P. Manish about Keynesian economics and Keynesian business cycle theory. Dr. Manish is an assistant professor of economics in the Sorrell College of Business and a member of the Manuel H. Johnson Center of Political Economy at Troy University. His areas of interest include development economics and economic history, monetary and business cycle theory, entrepreneurship and price theory, and the history of economic thought. You can follow his work at gpmanish.com. That's gpmanish.com, and at libertyclassroom.com, where he is a faculty member. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Keynes-cycle. Dr. Manish, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
So let's talk about who is John Maynard Keynes and what were some of the key points of Keynesian economics? Just a brief overview.
Well, John Maynard Keynes was probably the most influential economist of the 20th century, definitely in the field of macroeconomics. He wrote a very famous book in 1936 called The General Theory of Interest, Employment, and Money, which revolutionized many aspects of economic theory, and therefore, you had the Keynesian revolution. Especially, he wrote it in the middle of the Great Depression, and he offered a completely novel theory of explaining recessions, which since then has become the mainstream way of understanding why market economies go into a recession. He was also more than an economist. He was probably one of the most famous economists before World War II. He wrote a very famous book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace at the end of World War I, which was what made him famous to begin with. So he was a sort of a public intellectual as well, and that's why his economic work carried a lot of weight. Now, as far as Keynesian economics is concerned, he's primarily known, as I mentioned, for his theory of recessions. And really, the core of his book is 1936 is that, a capitalist or a market-based economy is always on a knife edge, and it's inherently unstable, and it can lurch into a recession at any point, and then it'll get stuck there, and there are no real market forces that can bring it out of that slump of high unemployment and low output and back to a full employment situation.
So what did he say about the source of that instability?
Well, the core thesis of his was that these sources are primarily psychological, and that's why it has this knife edge property. So it's really to do with the psychological views of investors. He had the famous concept of animal spirits. He said that because a lot of investment in a developed capitalist economy deals with durable capital goods that are very long-lived, and that long-term expectations are very hard to form in any sort of rational fashion, and therefore investors fall back on these hunches and instincts and urges which are not really rational, and he summed all of this up in his concept of animal spirits. And so therefore for him, investment is subject to these irrational sort of psychological waves of optimism and pessimism, and when investors become pessimistic, that's the first cause that causes the economy to lurch into a recession.
And what were some of the solutions in Keynes's mind to these animal spirit behaviors?
Well, because the problem is psychological, for him, because as long as these psychological propensities on the parts of investors, but also on the parts of consumers, consumers, according to him, would if they would spend more money, then they would make up for the problems with investors. But really, because of the fact that it's all driven by these psychological propensities, the market kind of has no forces within itself to bring it out of this slump. And so therefore, you have to have outside intervention. And for Keynes, the two main ways of intervening were either through fiscal policy, and where the government spends more money as part of its budgetary expenditure, or through expansionary monetary policy, where the central bank prints a lot more money, drives the interest rate down, and therefore stimulates more investment. He seemed to, especially towards the later years, especially around the time of the general theory, he seemed to favor fiscal policy more than monetary policy, but he was open to both.
Okay, so let's go back to the causes for a moment, and then we'll look at the solutions a little more. But how would you evaluate the merits of his views of the causes, this sort of psychological an animal spirit notion that creates depressions and recessions.
Well, one of the biggest issues with Keynes' whole theoretical framework, this conceptual framework, is the level of aggregation involved. This, for example, was one of the biggest criticisms leveled at him by Hayek during the famous debates that they had in the 1930s. And because of the high level of aggregation in his theory, he always theorizes as if entrepreneurs as a whole do something, or consumers as a group do something. So he doesn't recognize the fact that entrepreneurs are heterogeneous and are not homogeneous, and that there can be differing abilities on the parts of different entrepreneurs to predict the future and to adjust production conditions to these uncertain conditions of the future. He's definitely onto something in that his criticisms apply a lot to the neoclassical mainstream because they don't ever consider uncertainty as part of their theoretical framework at all. So from that perspective, Keynes does seem to be more realistic, and he seems to be making a point. But when you consider the work of many Austrian economists who do consider uncertainty and integrate it as part of their theories, the big difference there comes about due to the fact that in the Austrian framework, you don't have the same level of aggregation involved, and you don't have therefore, you don't have entrepreneurs all doing the same wrong thing or all doing the same right thing due to some external psychological problem or factor.
And the Austrians, what were some of the reasons that they thought that we had these business cycles, other than the difference in aggregation? What were some of the reasons that they put forth that Keynes did not put forth?
Well, it really stems from the level of aggregation involved. And so and again, coming back to Hayek and the criticisms he leveled against Keynes, his most important one was, to say that, well, when Keynes talks about investment, when he talks about the behavior of entrepreneurs with respect to investments that they undertake, he seems to treat investment as a homogeneous activity when actually, there are different investors investing in different capital goods which are heterogeneous. In other words, we have a production structure, and we don't have like one kind of capital good, but we have many different kinds of capital goods. So for example, you have people investing in, say, trucks which take food to Walmart that would be close to final consumption. But then you have other investors who are investing in nanotechnology, which is going to yield consumption many years later. And that's a different kind of investment activity because it's much further away in time from consumption. And therefore, for Hayek, what causes the business cycle is that when the interest rate is artificially lowered due to expansionary monetary policy, it affects these investment activities in different, in these different stages of production, as he called it. It affects the investment activity in the stages or in the production processes further away from consumption in a manner different to the way it affects those activities which are closer to consumption. And that really, these sort of activity, the differing impacts on different parts of the structure of production are what in the Austrian framework caused the business cycle. And of course, what Hayek and Mises, argued was that if you don't disaggregate and you just treat all investment as aggregates, you're completely blind to what can happen when the interest rate is artificially lowered.
Well, and another place where it seems like there are a lot of differences between Keynesians and Austrians in the way they view business cycles is the role of central banking. So what did Keynes think about central banking and the role that plays in business cycles?
Well, for him, central banking and increases in money supply and the lowering of the interest rate through increasing money supply was one of the primary ways out of a recession. While that is precisely what causes a recession in the Austrian framework. And of course, again, it comes back to the same point that for Keynes, because investment is this aggregate activity, he sees everybody he doesn't see the heterogeneity but the homogeneity in the activity of investment. For him, entrepreneurs he ignores the fact that you have these different stages of production where some entrepreneurs are investing in things that are closer to consumption and some further away from consumption, and therefore for him, when you have a recession, you have a decline in investment activity altogether. And therefore, when the central bank lowers the interest rate, that stimulates investment activity altogether. And he completely neglects the fact that different investors will behave differently to the same decline in the interest rate. And so, therefore, for him, the lowering of the interest rate is really benign. And if anything, it is a good thing to get an economy out of the recession, but in the Austrian perspective, it's exactly what causes the recession in the first place. So doing that is not going to help alleviate any of the problems that emerge to begin with.
And we kind of see that with the way that Keynesians approach certain economic measures and figures that are released by the government, such as the spending figures and GDP figures. We see that Absolutely. It's very much, see this figure right here, so we do this. It seems very almost data-driven based off of overall figures.
Yes, and that's largely, again, because for Keynes, he theorized in terms of investment goods, consumption goods, output, these aggregates, and not in terms of, how is it that he didn't disaggregate these aggregates and didn't talk about how entrepreneurs in different parts of the economy will behave differently in different scenarios. And as a result, you're absolutely correct. So a lot of the fact that a lot of policy making, especially from those who have a Keynesian or who are favorable to the ideas of Keynes, they focus a lot on just these, the brute aggregates, and they doctor their policy prescriptions by just looking at how those aggregates behave. But for someone like Hayek, that's exactly the problem. He would say that you're blind to everything that's going on within the aggregate, and which is what is really important.
Well, and another aggregate figure that Keynesians seem to look at a lot is unemployment numbers. Now, there are all sorts of issues with the way the unemployment rate is calculated that we won't get into right now. But what does the Keynesian view of these unemployment numbers have to do with their view of the idleness of resources, and how does that tie back into their views of business cycle theory?
Well, again, the fact is that for Keynes, or for Keynesians, when unemployment rate is high, it's high all across the economy, or there's no distinction between the fact that, the unemployment that comes about in a recession is a result of a malinvestment of resources in the structure of production, that, the resources have been allocated in the wrong stages of production, that resources that should not have been invested in, activities far away from final consumption in time, that those resources are actually malinvested. So they don't distinguish, they're blind to the fact that these employment figures, while they do give you an important indicator of what's going on in the labor market, and of course, like you mentioned, there are deficiencies with this figure, but nevertheless, it does convey some information. But really, the problem lies in the fact that you have differing rates of unemployment in differing parts of the economy. So the problem in a business cycle is precisely the fact that you have too much employment in the wrong sectors and too little employment in the right sectors. And that is something that you cannot get when you just look at one figure as the unemployment rate.
How do Keynesians view savers and savings in the economy?
Well, very negatively. And again, this comes about due to the belief that when people save more, they consume less, and then when they consume less, the prices of consumer goods fall, and basically that acts as a deterrent to the price to investment activity altogether. Right? Again, we come back to the same theme that you have. You're thinking in terms of a consumption goods sector and an investment goods sector, and when people save more, there's a decline in the demand for consumer goods altogether, which translates into a decline in the investment sector altogether. So, for example, if people buy less bread, then the bread producers will demand less, flour. The flour producers will demand less wheat, and so on. So, for Keynes, saving is sort of a pernicious activity as far as output and employment are concerned, because he called this, in fact, the paradox of thrift, because he said, well, each of us think we benefit by saving, but in the aggregate we hurt. Society and society as a whole is hurt by this activity. Now, again, Hayek's and Mises's response to this would be, well, you're neglecting the fact that when consumption is declines and savings go up, yes, the prices of consumer goods do go down, but again, we have a structure of production. We have investment activity that should be disaggregated and not aggregated, and therefore, while entrepreneurs who are close in time to the production of consumer goods are going to be hurt by the saving activity, that essentially releases resources to be invested in activities that lie far away from consumption. So essentially, to take a very simple example, if you think of a Robinson Crusoe who's living alone on an island, if he was to consume less and if he was to therefore have food left over that he could utilize to produce more capital goods, that's sort of what the Austrian framework is arguing. You're saying, well, yeah, of course you're consuming less, and when you consume less, you're releasing resources that can be used to produce goods that will benefit you in the future. And if you aggregate all investment activity altogether, you're going to miss what's going on in the production structure.
All right. Now, I want to go back to something that you briefly mentioned earlier, and that's how Keynesians view remedies and solutions to the business cycle. And you mentioned that they talk about monetary policy and fiscal policy and these sorts of stimulus programs as part of a solution to the business cycle. Can you go into a little more detail on the sorts of policy prescriptions that they believe are correct when depressions and recessions arise?
All right. Firstly, I should mention that Keynes really, in the general theory, doesn't really emphasize the business cycle. He's focusing more on just the recession, right? So he's thinking about, well, why do we have this prolonged period of unemployment, a high unemployment and low output? The only, coherent business cycle theory that comes out of the book is, related to the whole animal spirits thing, that, well, the boom is when entrepreneurs are optimistic, and then the bust and the recession is when entrepreneurs become pessimistic. Now, you'll notice here, and this is, of course, when you push the Keynesian logic to its conclusion, you would have to say that there's really nothing wrong with the boom. That there's nothing that comes out of this theory that says that there's any sort of unsustainability in the boom itself. And I think that is very important to keep in mind when you think of the policy conclusions that they reach. Because, well, if there is really, if the recession just fell out of nowhere, and it has nothing to do with, prior activity in what we would call a boom, then, of course, these sort of policy actions, whether in terms of expansionary monetary policy or expansionary fiscal policy, fit into that framework. But if your argument is that, well, what caused the bust and the recession is itself the fact that you had expansionary monetary policy, then these policy tools look less favorable. Now, of course, when you come to the specific tools, when you come to expansionary fiscal policy, Keynesians and Keynes would say, well, you should dig more ditches, you should, build roads, send some guy to some planet, through some expanded space program. All of this stuff is going to help because you're essentially pumping more money into the economy, and therefore that stimulates overall economic activity. And when it comes to monetary policy, well, you would have said, the central bank should go out and buy bonds from the commercial banks, etc.
So which countries around the world have we seen that have really embraced these Keynesian remedies, and which ones have rejected them, and what have the different outcomes been?
Well, in the post-World War II era, really, I can't think of any country that's not adopted this framework, especially when combating a recession. In the field of macroeconomics, especially when confronted with a recession, there is widespread consensus really that a failure of expenditure, a failure of aggregate demand, which is a theory that Keynes proposed, is really the only thing that could cause a recession. And so one doesn't really see, at least in the post-World War II era, too much, difference in the way countries have reacted to a recession. Though in the period in the 70s and 80s, there was a reaction against some of the Keynesian ideas when you had the stagflation of the 70s in the US and UK. But nevertheless, when a recession does come about, so for example, the recession of 2008, Keynes always comes back.
All right. Now, before we move on, I want to return to a topic that we've been a phrase that we've been throwing around. That's business cycle. Can you give a very brief definition of what we mean by business cycle? I want to make sure all of our listeners are on the same
a business
page.
cycle would involve a boom and a bust, or a peak and a trough, if you wish. It's usually conceived of as like a wave-like. Output behaves in a wave-like fashion. So initially you have an increase in output, increase in employment, and that reaches like a peak, and then you have sort of a crisis. Something happens, and then the economy lurches into a sort of a downward trajectory. Output goes down, employment goes down, unemployment goes up until you hit like a trough, and then you have it coming back. These things recovering until you go through the same cycle again. And so really, when you think of a theory of the business cycle, you explain, what happens in the boom and why that leads into a bust, and then explain both the peak and the trough. While Keynes was more interested really in focusing on explaining why you get stuck in a trough, it was the case in the U.S. and a lot of Europe in the 1930s when he was writing the general theory.
I'd like to ask a question about the Phillips curve. I know we haven't really brought it up, but could you explain what the Phillips curve is and how it's used in Keynesian economics?
Well, in the traditional Keynesian economics, the Phillips curve is really, it signifies the existence of a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. So in other words, that there is some sort of trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So if the central bank prints more money, yes, that might cause some inflation in the short run, but you're going to have expansion in output and a reduction in the rate of unemployment, and so you might have to take a little bit of the pain and the hurt of inflation, but at the same time you're going to get the gift of lower unemployment, and that's really the concept of this trade-off between inflation and unemployment is what the Phillips curve signifies or embodies.
All right, and one other Keynesian concept I'd like to ask you about briefly, and this ties into some of our discussion about monetary and fiscal policy, but that's the multiplier. What is the Keynesian multiplier, and what are the merits of that concept?
Well, the Keynesian multiplier really says that when you have some sort of expansion of either through expansionary fiscal or monetary policy, if the government or the central bank spends more money, or more money is introduced into circulation, that is going to have a multiple effect on total output. So, for example, to take the case of the Obama stimulus in 2009, when if the size of the stimulus is $800 billion, then Keynes would have argued, and Keynesian would argue, that the overall impact on GDP is going to be some multiple of that. Maybe the multiplier happens to be 3, in which case the $800 billion expenditure is going to lead to a $2.4 trillion expansion in output. Now, the underlying logic of the multiplier is really the following. So let's say that the initial expenditure happens to be like $100 million on a road somewhere in Alabama, say, and so there's a contractor. He gets $100 million from the relevant department in the federal government, and he spends that money. And the money goes to his workers and people working in that project. Now all those guys will go and spend the money on all sorts of consumer goods. Now of course they won't spend all the money on consumption, which was one of Keynes's famous ideas with the fact that the marginal propensity to consume is less than 1. So in other words, if your income goes up by a certain amount, the amount by which consumption will go up will be less than 100%. So let's say the marginal propensity to consume happens to be 80%. So $80 million will be spent on consumer goods. But then if let's say all those guys spend the money on if they go to Walmart and spend the money on in Walmart, then Walmart sees an increase in its revenues. Walmart will produce more. They will spend that extra money, and that will go to their workers. They will then spend 80% of that on consumption, and so on. The cycle will go on until finally you have a multiple expansion in output.
So I know we were talking about how Keynesians will often use these big numbers to kind of determine where we are in the cycle and what should be done about it. So what would you say right now, where do you think we are in the Keynesian business cycle, or just in general?
Well, I mean, I just think we're in the midst of a long sort of lump recession. GDP growth has been anemic. The addition of jobs has been anemic. The unemployment rate is not picking that up, and that's really where we are. We're just in a long slump.
And what would you say are the correct solutions to that? I suppose it would be more to look at the cause of the boom and the cause of this slump,
Right.
and to factor that in. But what would you say are the proper solutions?
I mean, the best solution would really be to resuscitate market institutions as far as possible, allow for increased entrepreneurship, allow for the play of the price signals to guide investment and production activity, to allow people to save and to invest freely. Those would be my recommendations from a policy perspective.
Okay. Thank you for coming on the show. Do you have any recommended readings, and where can our listeners go to follow your work?
Recommended readings would really be, I would recommend them to read Keynes, Hayek, and Mises in the original. That would be my real recommendation. There are books out there that explain what Keynes was saying in the general theory, which is hard to understand at first blush. There's a book by Henry Hazlitt called The Failure of the New Economics. There's a book by Alvin Hansen called A Guide to Keynes. Those I think would be good to consult for Keynes. And for the Austrian part, I would say, just read Hayek, read Mises, read Rothbard. That would be my recommendation.
All right, yeah, and I know Rothbard has a little essay. I guess it's in a sort of a booklet form now. Economic Depressions, Their Cause and Cure. So we'll link to that.
Yes, that would be a great way to start off, definitely.
Yeah, so we'll link to that, and I'm glad you mentioned Hazlitt's book, Refuting Keynes. I was going to bring that up. We'll definitely link to that. So where can people follow your work? gpmanish.com, of course. And,
yes, that would be the best place. On my website would be the best. I usually put up whatever as papers get published, I put it up there.
All right, well, very good. So I want to remind everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Keynes-cycle. Keynes is spelled Keynes. So I know that can be a hard last name to spell. Keynes. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/Keynes-cycle. And we'll link to gpmanish.com. We'll link to libertyclassroom.com. We'll link to the Johnson Center at Troy University in Alabama. We'll link to all the books and essays that we've been discussing and that we've mentioned. And on that note, Dr. Manish, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. And hopefully we can speak with you again sometime soon.
Great. Yeah, thank you for having me on the show.
All right. And one final note to our listeners, we just recently got on Twitter. So our brand new Twitter account is at WUC Podcast, and we highly encourage everyone to follow us there. So thank you again, Dr. Manish, for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.